Asked about whether this meltdown was down to global factors yesterday, the Bank of England Governor, Andrew Bailey, said, "I don't really think that's the case." He also has said that he believed that the mini-budget had damaged the UK's standing internationally. You were in the room when the decisions were made about the mini-budget. He's kind of blaming you, isn't he?
Well, the decisions around the mini-budget were made by the former Chancellor and the former
You were in the
Prime Minister.
Treasury team.
Yeah, I was on the Treasury team, that's right. But the decisions, as you would expect, were made by the Chancellor, the previous Chancellor and the previous Prime Minister, who are no longer in post.
If people choose to enter a country illegally and unnecessarily, it is a bit, it's a bit of a cheek to then start complaining about the conditions when you've illegally entered a country without necessity. And they don't have to come here. They were in France already and previously often passed through Belgium, Germany and many other countries on the way. So we're doing our best, but the numbers are just overwhelming. And that's why we need to do more work with the French government to stop these crossings and also look at reforming the way that some of these international treaties are getting applied domestically, because it is making it very hard or basically impossible to properly police our borders.
OK. A bit of a cheek to complain about the conditions.
Well, I think if you enter a country illegally and unnecessarily in enormous numbers, tens of thousands.
As you mentioned, you are the policing minister. You're new to that role. Is it
That's
10
right,
days?
about a
are you
week.
10 days into that job?
Yeah, roughly 9-10 days.
Obviously, trust is very important in government, as you well know. And it's our first time speaking to you in that role. What are your credentials for being policing minister?
Well, I've been a Member of Parliament for the last 7 years. I've always worked closely with our local police.
As a former immigration compliance minister, do you accept that Manston is not legally compliant now?
I'm not sure I do accept that. Significant improvements have been made recently. We had similar challenges over the Napier site in Folkestone, and we made improvements there to make it compliant. So, but we should keep in mind that there is a huge challenge we've got here. About 40,000 people so far have illegally entered the UK so far this year on small boats. And that is a huge operational challenge. It's very, very hard to deal with that. Now, these journeys are totally unnecessary because France, obviously, is a safe country with a well-functioning asylum system. These journeys don't need to be made. No one is fleeing war in France.
Okay.
These journeys should not be getting made in the first place.
Well, many people would argue they need more legal routes to come in, and
let's
many
talk
of these
about
are
that.
asylum seekers.
The Home Secretary went down to see the situation in Manston herself yesterday. There is some criticism. Was it really necessary for her to use a Chinook helicopter at a cost of £3,500 per hour? Let's say she was in the air and 2.5 hours. £10,000. Why couldn't she quite rightly have had a fast police escort down the A20?
So my understanding was that the helicopter wasn't simply to get from A to B. She was also inspecting operations in the English Channel, where obviously these boats are crossing. So it was for that wider purpose. And in fact, when I was in France a year or two ago, when I was immigration minister, as you said, the French authorities there took me in a helicopter to look at the French beaches and look at the places where these illegal embarkations
What did you learn
were
from
taking
being
place from.
airborne? What did you learn from being airborne, Minister?
You get a much. That's a good question. You get a much better sense of the terrain. You understand the operational area. You can see the routes to the beaches.
It's actually not just the horror of the crossing. It's a failure of the Home Office and the Immigration Service to make the system work as is.
So I know that the new Home Secretary is initiating work to speed up the decision-making around asylum. There has obviously been an enormous increase in intake because of the illegal and dangerous and unnecessary channel crossings that has caused these backlogs to develop. But I know the Home Secretary is focusing on that as an area. The other issue we have is that the way that some international treaties get interpreted by our domestic courts make it very hard sometimes to operate the immigration system and, for example, return people to their country of origin.
We've got reports of a second group of migrants left stranded at Victoria Coast Station.
Well, they've mostly gone to hotels. There are about 4,500 extra hotels have been procured.
But what about these people that have been stranded at Victoria Coast Station?
Yeah, so
Why has that happened?
there were two groups of people, and what I've been told by the people on the immigration side of the Home Office is that both groups of people had told immigration officials at Manston they had addresses to go to, so friends and family. Obviously, that turned out subsequently not to be the case, but the information that Home Office officials had understood was they had places to go to, because many of the people do have friends and family in the UK already.
So this was a mistake?
Yeah, well, clearly that understanding was not accurate.
Regardless of kind of motivation or, why they want to leave France or whatever, they come here and then they're treated appallingly, absolutely appallingly.
Well, I just don't accept that. We're spending something like £2 or £3 billion a year looking after people who have entered the country illegally and unnecessarily. I think, frankly, that is pretty generous, actually, and our asylum accommodation is better than most European countries. In terms of people who are genuinely in need of protection, we are a generous country. If you look at what we did with people in Syria during Assad's terrible actions there, I think over 20,000 Syrians were legally resettled directly into the UK. We've had, I think, so far 20,000 people or 23,000 people from Afghanistan in the last year and a half, over 100,000 people from Hong Kong fleeing the Chinese Communist Party, and about 150,000 people from Ukraine. So this is a very generous country that looks after people in genuine need.
Can I just say, I appreciate you were Chief Secretary of the Treasury, you were 2IC, second in command, but do you not think you owe an apology to the British public?
Well, as I say, I wasn't the decision maker. I didn't take the decisions.
Were you against the decisions then? Can I ask that?
Well, I was. I mean, I think the strategy they had to try and drive growth was a sort of well-founded strategy. I had a view myself that it should have been a balanced package with looking at the spending side of the ledger as well as the tax side, and that there should have been a sort of fiscal framework sitting around that. Neither of which obviously happened. And of course, what the new Chancellor and new Prime Minister are doing is exactly that in their 17th of November
Indeed, but
statement.
you were
overruled. And that's why ultimately I wasn't the decision maker, as you'd expect. Those kind of massive decisions about the economy.
Let's leave it with. Let's leave it with. Thank you. Unless you were not overruled, we'll leave the interview there. It's over to you. You were overruled. I'm grateful for your time.
Last year, not just last year, but also this year, according to the IMF, the UK had the highest GDP growth in the G7, not just last year, but this year as well. So we are starting from a good position, but in common with Western economies, developed economies around the world, there are challenges, but we can meet them.
But a recession for 8 quarters, whatever position you start in, that's a pretty bad place to end up. And Andrew Bailey did say that we were hours from financial meltdown following the mini-budget. Are you quite embarrassed to have been involved in that? Do you have any regrets? Do you feel like you want to apologise?
Well, I think Liz Truss has already apologised, and she's obviously
would you like to?
Well, I say the decisions. Well, although I, along with other people, was a minister in that government at the time, those decisions were taken principally by the former Prime Minister, to a lesser extent by the former Chancellor, and she has apologised for that, and then neither of them are in office any longer.